I've sat across from thousands of people over the years, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves. We talk about the truth setting us free, but most people treat the truth like a physical threat, something they have to dodge and weave around just to keep their ego intact. That's where I met Marcus. When Marcus walked onto my stage, he didn't just walk. He carried the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. But the problem was, he thought that weight belonged to everyone else. He had that look in his eye, that defiant, prove me wrong stare that usually tells me I'm dealing with someone who has spent a lifetime perfecting the art of the victim. He wasn't a bad man in the traditional sense, but he was a destructive one. He was a man who had managed to set his entire life on fire and then stood there holding the matches, screaming at the wind for blowing too hard. My job in these situations isn't to be a friend, and it's certainly not to offer some sort of hollow validation. My job is to be a mirror. I have to show people what they've been refusing to see, even if it hurts, because you cannot change what you do not acknowledge. Marcus was 38 years old, but emotionally, he was stuck somewhere around 14. He arrived at the studio with his wife, Sarah, and his mother, Brenda. Sarah looked like she hadn't slept in a decade. There was a profound exhaustion in her eyes that goes beyond being tired. It was the kind of weariness that comes from carrying the emotional load of two people for way too long. Brenda, on the other hand, was the architect of the situation, though she didn't know it yet. She was hovering, fussing over Marcus's tie, whispering platitudes in his ear as if he were a toddler about to get a flu shot. This was the ecosystem Marcus lived in. A wife who provided the stability he lacked, and a mother who provided the excuses he craved. The central problem was simple on the surface, but complex underneath. Marcus had lost 4 jobs in 3 years. He was tens of thousands of dollars in debt. He was facing a potential legal situation regarding a failed business venture where he claimed he was scammed. But to Marcus, none of these were consequences of his own choices. To him, these were things that happened to him. He was the protagonist in a tragedy where everyone else was a villain or a fool. I remember watching him in the green room before we started rolling. He was pacing, muttering to himself about how the producers had framed the introductory video. He was already building his defense. That's a hallmark of a chronic blamer. They aren't interested in the why of their behavior. They are obsessed with the how of their defense. They are always in a courtroom, even when they're sitting in their own living room. When we finally sat down on stage, the air was thick. You could feel the tension radiating off Sarah. She was at the end of her rope, and Marcus was still trying to tie knots in it. I started by asking him a simple question. Marcus, why are you here? He didn't even pause. He went into a 10-minute monologue about the unfairness of the corporate world, the betrayal of his former business partner, and the constant nagging from Sarah that made it impossible for him to focus on his vision. He used a lot of big words to describe a very small reality. He wanted me to see him as a misunderstood genius, a man of high integrity who was simply too good for a corrupt world. I let him talk. You have to let them talk, because eventually they'll hand you the keys to their own prison. The more Marcus talked, the more the pattern emerged. It was a pattern of externalization. In psychology, we talk about the locus of control. People with an internal locus of control believe they are the masters of their fate. People like Marcus have an entirely external locus of control. To them, life is something that is done to them. If they're late, it's the traffic. If they're broke, it's the economy. If they're unfaithful, it's because their partner didn't give them enough attention. It's a very convenient way to live because it means you never have to feel the sting of regret or the weight of shame. But it also means you are completely powerless. If you aren't the cause of your problems, you can't be the solution. I looked at Marcus and I didn't see a victim. I saw a man who was desperately afraid of his own mediocrity. He was using blame as a shield to protect himself from the realization that he was failing because he wasn't putting in the work. As we delved into his backstory, the roots of this behavior began to surface, as they always do. We don't wake up one day at 38 and decide to start blaming the world for our problems. It's a learned behavior, a survival mechanism that actually starts in childhood. Marcus grew up in a household where Brenda, his mother, had protected him from every possible consequence. When he got a bad grade, she didn't tell him to study harder. She went to the school and yelled at the teacher. When he got cut from the baseball team, she told him the coach was biased. She thought she was being a good mother. She thought she was building his self-esteem. In reality, she was lobotomizing his sense of responsibility. She was teaching him that his failures weren't his fault, and therefore he didn't need to change. He grew up thinking that the world owed him a soft landing, no matter how badly he flew the plane. This is what I call malignant entitlement. It's not just that he felt he deserved things, it's that he felt he was exempt from the rules that govern everyone else. During our conversation, Marcus described his childhood as perfect, which is always a red flag for me. No one has a perfect childhood, and if you think you did, it usually means you're suppressing a lot of reality or you were raised in a vacuum where you were never allowed to fail. Marcus was the golden child who never actually won any gold. He was told he was special so many times that he started to believe it was a permanent state of being rather than something earned through character and effort. As he transitioned into adulthood, that belief system collided head-on with a world that doesn't care who your mother thinks you are. The world only cares about what you can produce and how you treat people. Marcus couldn't produce, and he treated people like supporting characters in the Marcus show. I turned to Brenda and asked her if she ever let Marcus fail. She looked at me with this wounded expression, the kind of look that says, "How could you ask such a cruel thing?" She told me she just wanted him to be happy. I told her that by trying to make him happy, she had made him dysfunctional. You see, the greatest gift a parent can give a child is the opportunity to fail while the stakes are low. If you don't learn how to handle a D in the 5th grade, you aren't going to know how to handle foreclosure in your 30s. You're just going to look for someone to blame. Marcus sat there, listening to me talk to his mother, and you could see the resentment building. He didn't like the spotlight being turned on the mechanics of his upbringing. He wanted to stay in the present, where he could complain about his enemies. He tried to interrupt, to redirect the conversation back to his business partner, but I shut that down quickly. I told him, "We'll get to the business partner, Marcus," but the look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated shock. It was as if I had spoken a foreign language. He had spent his whole life avoiding that specific realization. He started to stammer, his face flushing a deep red. He looked at Sarah, hoping for support, but she just looked away. That was the first crack in the dam. When your primary enabler starts to withdraw their support, the victim starts to panic. Marcus wasn't used to being alone in his narrative. He was used to having a chorus of people agreeing with him or at least staying quiet enough for him to believe they agreed. Now, in the harsh light of the studio, with the cameras rolling and a man who wasn't buying his story sitting across from him, Marcus was beginning to realize that his shield was made of cardboard. We were just scratching the surface of the escalation that led him here. The years of mounting tension and broken promises that had finally brought his family to a breaking point. It wasn't just about the jobs or the money anymore. It was about the very soul of his marriage and his own identity. I turned my attention to Sarah, because in every dynamic like this, there's a partner who is holding the ladder while the other person climbs toward a cliff. Sarah had met Marcus in their early 20s. Back then, his arrogance looked like confidence. His refusal to take an entry-level job looked like ambition. She told me, with tears brimming in her eyes, that she thought she was marrying a man who was going to change the world. She didn't realize she was marrying a man who was going to blame the world for not recognizing his greatness. She spent 15 years being his cheerleader, his bank account, and his emotional punching bag. Every time he lost a job, she was the one who updated his resume. She was the one who made the calls to the utility companies to beg for extensions. And she was the one who told their 2 young children that Daddy is just looking for the right opportunity. I asked her, Sarah, at what point did you realize that the right opportunity was actually a phantom he was chasing to avoid real work? She paused, and you could hear a pin drop in that studio. She said it was 3 years ago when Marcus had been fired from a senior management position at a logistics firm. He had been there for 6 months. He came home and told her that the CEO was threatened by his intellect and had conspired with HR to push him out. Marcus had spent weeks locked in his home office drafting legal manifestos and threatening lawsuits that never materialized. Meanwhile, Sarah was working double shifts at the hospital as a nurse just to keep food on the table. She said the breaking point wasn't the job loss itself, it was the fact that Marcus didn't even ask how she was doing. He didn't notice the circles under her eyes or the way her hands shook from exhaustion. He only wanted to talk about his case. This is the hallmark of the narcissistic vacuum. People like Marcus don't just take your money or your time, they take your peace. They consume the emotional oxygen in the room until everyone else is gasping for air. Marcus sat there as Sarah spoke, and I watched his body language. He wasn't listening to understand, he was listening to refute. He was vibrating with the need to interrupt, to correct the record. He kept shaking his head, scoffing under his breath, trying to signal to the audience that Sarah was being hysterical or misremembering the facts. I stopped him. I said, Marcus, zip it. You've had the floor for 38 years. For once in your life, you're going to sit there and listen to the cost of your behavior. I wanted to dig into the escalation of his business venture because that was the catalyst for them being on the show. Marcus had taken their remaining savings, $40,000 Sarah had inherited from her grandmother, and invested it into a can't-lose tech startup with a guy he met at a bar. No contracts, no due diligence, just a gut feeling. When the guy disappeared with the money, Marcus didn't apologize. He didn't admit he'd been reckless. Instead, he claimed Sarah had cursed the deal with her negativity. He told her that if she had believed in him more, the universe would have provided a different outcome. That is a level of gaslighting that is almost predatory. He was using her own grief and her own financial loss as a weapon against her. How do you justify that, Marcus? I asked him. How do you look at a woman who has sacrificed her inheritance, her sleep, and her sanity for you and tell her that she's the reason you failed? He didn't have an answer that made sense. He started rambling about energy and visionary mindsets, the kind of pseudo-intellectual garbage people use when they don't have a leg to stand on. I told him he sounded like a con artist who was trying to con himself. I told him that he wasn't a visionary, he was a parasite. I don't use that word lightly, but when you are living off the labor of others while simultaneously belittling them, there isn't a better word in the English language. The escalation didn't stop with the money. It bled into their parenting. Sarah told me about a time their 10-year-old son, Leo, had failed a math test. Marcus hadn't encouraged the boy to study. Instead, he told Leo that the teacher was out to get him because she didn't like Marcus. He was teaching his son the same toxic curriculum Brenda had taught him, that the world is a rigged game and effort doesn't matter. That was the moment Sarah said she knew she had to leave. She realized she wasn't just dealing with a husband who was a struggling dreamer. She was dealing with a man who was actively poisoning the next generation. She couldn't let her son grow up to be Marcus. Brenda, sitting on the other side of Marcus, started crying then. But it wasn't a cry of empathy for Sarah. It was a cry of defense for her baby boy. She started saying that Sarah was being too hard on him, that Marcus had a sensitive soul and high-functioning anxiety. I turned to Brenda and I didn't hold back. I told her that she was his dealer. She was the one who had been supplying him with the drug of excuses for decades. Every time he did something wrong, she provided the rationalization. I told her that by protecting him, she had actually crippled him. A man who has never been allowed to feel the heat of the fire will never learn not to play with matches. The tension in the room was reaching a boiling point. Marcus was trapped between the two women who defined his life, one who was finally refusing to play the game and one who was desperately trying to keep the game going. He looked like a cornered animal. This is the part of the process where the victim starts to get aggressive. When the charm doesn't work and the excuses don't work, they turn to anger. It's a last-ditch effort to regain control of the narrative through intimidation. Marcus stood up, his face contorted, and pointed a finger at me. He said I didn't know him, that I was just a TV doctor who wanted ratings, and that I couldn't possibly understand the complexities of his life. I didn't move. I've been yelled at by experts, and Marcus was an amateur. I let him vent for a minute, let him show the world exactly who he was when he didn't get his way. When he finally ran out of breath, I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Sit down, Marcus. You're embarrassing yourself." And the strange thing is, he did. He collapsed back into his chair, the fire going out of him as quickly as it had started. That's the thing about people who live a lie. They don't have any real staying power. Their anger is just a performance, a smokescreen. Underneath all that bluster, Marcus was just a scared little boy who was terrified that the world was finally seeing him for what he was, an ordinary man who had made extraordinary mistakes. I told him that we weren't leaving that stage until we stripped away every single one of his excuses. We were going to talk about the jobs, the money, the lies, and the impact on his children, and we were going to do it without him mentioning his business partner, the unfair economy, or Sarah's supposed negativity even once. I told him that if he uttered one more excuse, I was going to end the interview and Sarah was going to walk out that door and never look back. I asked her, "Am I right, Sarah? If he doesn't own this today, is it over?" She didn't hesitate. She looked him right in the face and said, "It's already over, Marcus. This is your last chance to save whatever's left of your dignity." That set the stage for the confrontation. We weren't just talking about behaviors anymore. We were talking about the core of his character. I had to get him to see that his entire identity was built on a foundation of sand. He thought he was a big picture guy, but he couldn't even manage the small picture of his own daily life. He thought he was a leader, but no one was following him. He thought he was a victim, but he was the one holding the whip. We had to break through that delusion if there was any hope of him ever becoming a man his son could look up to. I sat there for a moment, letting the silence do the work. Silence is a powerful tool in a room full of noise. Marcus was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He looked smaller than he had 10 minutes ago. I leaned in, lowering my voice but keeping it firm. I told him, "Marcus, you've spent your entire life trying to be the smartest person in every room you walk into. You've used your vocabulary and your vision to keep people at a distance to make sure no one ever gets close enough to see that you're terrified. You're terrified that if you actually tried, if you really put your shoulder to the wheel and gave it everything you had, you might still fail. And in your mind, a misunderstood genius is a lot more attractive than a man who just didn't work hard enough." But let me tell you something, friend. There is no dignity in a lie, no matter how pretty you dress it up. I decided it was time to address the business partner who supposedly scammed him. I had my team do some digging before the show. It turns out there was no tech startup. There was a guy, yes, but he was a known grifter. And Marcus had been warned by at least 3 different people before he handed over Sarah's money. Marcus didn't lose that money because he was scammed in the traditional sense. He lost it because he was looking for a shortcut. He wanted the prestige of being a founder without the decade of 80-hour weeks it takes to actually build something. I put the documents on the table between us. I didn't hand them to him. I just let them sit there, a physical manifestation of the reality he'd been running from. You knew, didn't you, I asked him? You knew that guy was a flake. You knew that investment was a gamble at best and a disaster at worst. But you did it anyway because you wanted to feel important. You wanted to walk into the house and tell Sarah that you were finally the big man you always told her you were. You didn't do it for the family, Marcus. You did it for your own ego, and you used her grandmother's legacy to fund your fantasy. Sarah made a soft, strangled sound next to him. It was the sound of a woman finally seeing the man she loved for who he really was, and it was devastating. Marcus tried one last time to pivot. He said, I was trying to build a future for us. I was trying to make sure our kids never had to worry about money. I cut him off. Stop it. Just stop. Don't you dare bring those kids into this. You weren't building a future. You were burning down the present. You were taking the security your wife worked for and tossing it into a bonfire of your own making. And the worst part isn't even the money, Marcus. It's the fact that you won't even say the words, I was wrong, I was selfish, I messed up. Until you can say those words and mean them, you are a dangerous man to be around because you will do it again. You'll find another partner, another opportunity, and another person to blame when it falls apart. I turned to Brenda. She was still dabbing at her eyes, looking like she wanted to reach out and touch Marcus's arm. I told her, Brenda, you're sitting here crying because you think I'm being mean to your son. But what you need to realize is that you're the one who's been the most mean to him. By never holding him accountable, you've left him completely unequipped for the world. You've sent him out into a hurricane with a paper umbrella. You've told him he was a king, but you didn't give him a kingdom or the character to rule one. You need to decide right now, do you want to keep being his enabler in chief, or do you want to see your son actually grow up to be a man? Because if you keep doing what you're doing, you're going to be the one paying his rent when he's 60, and he'll still be blaming you for his problems. Brenda looked stunned. She stammered something about how Marcus had always been different and special. I told her that everyone is special to their mother, but the world doesn't care about special. The world cares about contributing. I asked Marcus if he felt special right now. He didn't answer. He just kept staring at those papers on the table. This was the moment of breakthrough or breakdown. He was at a crossroads. He could either admit the truth and start the long, painful process of rebuilding his life, or he could walk off that stage, find another excuse, and continue his slide into irrelevance. I told him a story about a man I knew years ago who was in a similar spot. He was a chronic blamer, a guy who had lost everything because he couldn't take responsibility. He ended up living in his car, still complaining about how the system had failed him. I told Marcus that man died in that car alone and bitter. He never realized that the only person who had the power to save him was the same person who had destroyed him. You're heading for that car, Marcus. You're halfway there already. Sarah is your lifeline, and she's about to let go. Brenda is your crutch, and I'm about to kick it away. What are you going to do when you're standing on your own 2 feet with nowhere to hide? Marcus finally looked up. His eyes were red, and for the first time, he didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had been running a race for 20 years and had finally realized he was on a treadmill going nowhere. He whispered, I don't know how to be anyone else. That was the most honest thing he had said all day. It was the aha moment we look for. It wasn't a confession of guilt so much as a confession of incompetence. He didn't know how to be a man of character because he had never practiced it. He had spent all his energy on the facade, and there was nothing behind it. Well, Marcus, I said, the first step to being someone else is to stop being the guy you are right now. You stop the lies, you stop the excuses, you go get a job, any job, and you hand your paycheck over to your wife. You start paying back the debt you owe this family, not just in money, but in trust. You show up for your son, not as a visionary who's too good for the world, but as a father who's willing to work a 9-to-5 to put food on the table. You earn your way back into this family's respect because right now you don't have an ounce of it. I looked at Sarah. Is that enough, Sarah? If he does the work, if he really, truly does the work, is there something left to save? She looked at Marcus for a long time. The silence stretched out, and you could see the history of their marriage playing out behind her eyes. Finally, she said, I don't know if I love him anymore, Dr. Phil, but I want to see him be a father. For my kid's sake, I want him to be a man they can be proud of. If he can do that, then maybe we can talk about a future. But I'm not holding my breath. That was the most realistic outcome we could hope for. There were no magic wands, no instant forgiveness, just a slim, fragile possibility of redemption based entirely on Marcus's willingness to do something he had never done before, tell the truth and work hard. I told Marcus that I would provide him with the resources, counseling, career coaching, the whole 9 yards, but I also told him that I wouldn't be checking in to see if he was doing it. I told him, the world is going to check in on you, Marcus. Your bank account is going to check in, your wife is going to check in, and most importantly, your son is going to check in. He's watching you right now, trying to decide if he wants to be like you or if he wants to be better than you. Don't let him down. As we wrapped up the session, the atmosphere in the studio had shifted. The heat was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. Brenda was quiet, Sarah was resolute, and Marcus was quiet. He wasn't defending himself anymore. He wasn't nodding or scoffing. He was just sitting there looking at his hands. I told him that the Marcus who walked onto this stage was dead, or at least he should be. The man who left this stage needed to be someone new. I shook his hand, and I could feel how much he was shaking. It was the first time in his life he didn't have a plan. And for a man like him, that was the only place where real change could start. As the camera stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, the real work began. People think the breakthrough happens under the bright lights, but the truth is, the stage is just where we break the soil. The planting happens in the quiet moments afterward, in the green room, in the car ride home, and in the dark of night when there's no audience to perform for. I walked backstage and found Marcus sitting on a crate in the hallway, his head in his hand. He didn't look like the defiant, misunderstood genius who had walked in 3 hours earlier. He looked like a man who had finally realized he was bankrupt, not just financially, but emotionally. I stood there for a second watching him. This is the part they don't always see on TV. The moment of profound emptiness that follows the collapse of a lifelong lie. I walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. I didn't say anything at first. Sometimes silence is the only thing that can hold the weight of a realization like that. When he finally looked up, his eyes were clear. The fog of excuses had lifted, at least for the moment. I told him, Marcus, you've spent 38 years building a prison out of other people's faults. Today, we opened the door. But you're the one who has to walk through it. I can give you the map, I can give you the boots, but I'm not going to carry you. If you go home and start blaming the traffic for being late to your first counseling session, or if you start blaming Sarah for not being supportive enough while you're looking for a job, you're right back where you started. And let me tell you, The next time that door closes, it might stay shut for good. He nodded slowly. He told me he was scared. I told him he should be. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done while your knees are shaking. I watched him walk toward the exit where Sarah was waiting. She didn't move toward him. She didn't offer a hug or a reassuring word. She just stood there watching him with a look of cautious appraisal. She was done being his safety net. She was now his judge, and that's exactly what he needed. He needed to earn his way back into her life one honest day at a time. I saw Brenda hovering nearby, looking like she wanted to rush over and tell him everything was going to be okay. I caught her eye and shook my head. She stopped. For the first time, she let him walk those last 20 feet to his wife on his own. It was a small victory, but in this business, you take the wins where you can get them. In the months that followed, I kept tabs on Marcus through my team. Change is never a straight line. It's a jagged, messy process of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Marcus struggled. He got a job working in a warehouse, a far cry from the executive positions he felt he deserved. He told his counselor that he felt humiliated every time he put on that vest. He felt like his intellect was being wasted. But that's the thing about character. It isn't built in the boardroom. It's built in the trenches. He stayed in that job. He stayed because he had to look at Sarah every night and show her a paycheck that he had actually earned with his own sweat. He stayed because he started to see the way his son, Leo, looked at him when he came home, tired but honest. It wasn't a fairy tale. Sarah and Marcus didn't have a magical reconciliation where all the hurt vanished. You don't erase 15 years of gaslighting and financial ruin with 6 months of good behavior. They ended up separating for a while, a move I actually encouraged. Marcus needed to learn how to be a man without Sarah there to manage his life, and Sarah needed to learn how to be a woman without the constant weight of his failures dragging her down. They started dating again after 4 months, but this time the dynamic was different. Marcus wasn't trying to sell her on a dream. He was trying to show her a reality. He stopped talking about visions and started talking about his daily goals. He stopped blaming his mother for his upbringing and started thanking her for her support while setting firm boundaries about her interference. Brenda, to her credit, began attending her own sessions. She had to deal with the realization that her protection had been a form of control, a way to keep Marcus dependent on her so she would never be alone. When she stopped being his enabler, she had to face her own emptiness. It was painful, but it was necessary. The entire family ecosystem had to be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. This is the reality of accountability. It's not just about one person changing, it's about the entire system refusing to accept the old lies. I think about Marcus often because his story is the story of so many people who feel stuck in a life they don't like. We live in a culture that rewards the victim mentality, a culture that tells us that if we're unhappy, it must be someone else's fault. We've become experts at identifying our trauma, but amateurs at taking responsibility for our recovery. Marcus had to learn that his past was an explanation, but it wasn't an excuse. He had to learn that the labels he wore, the misunderstood genius, the victim of circumstance, the unlucky dreamer, were just masks he used to hide his fear of being ordinary. The last time I spoke with Marcus, it was about a year after he had been on the show. He wasn't a millionaire. He wasn't a founder. He was a shift supervisor at that same warehouse. He told me that for the first time in his life, he could look at himself in the mirror without flinching. He said, "Dr. Phil, I used to think being important was the most important thing. I was wrong. Being reliable is the most important thing." That's a powerful insight. Reliability is the bedrock of trust, and trust is the currency of any healthy relationship. He had finally stopped trying to be a big man and started being a good man. As a psychologist, I've seen it all. I've seen people who have every reason in the world to fail, who somehow find the strength to thrive. And I've seen people who have every advantage, who choose to throw it all away because they can't handle the weight of their own choices. The difference is always accountability. It's the willingness to say, I am the problem, and therefore I am the solution. Marcus had to go through the fire to get to that truth. He had to lose his pride to find his dignity. It's a hard road, and not everyone makes it. But for those who do, the reward isn't just a better life, it's a better soul. When I look back at that title, I blamed everyone else until Dr. Phil showed me what I really was. I realized that what he really was wasn't a monster or a failure. He was just a human being who had lost his way. He had let his ego become his compass, and it had led him into a swamp. My role wasn't to punish him, it was to give him a new compass. Life doesn't ask us to be perfect. It only asks us to be honest. It asks us to show up, to do the work, and to stop looking for someone else to carry our pack. Marcus finally understood that. He stopped looking at the horizon for a ship that was never coming and started building a boat of his own. And in the end, that's the only way any of us ever get home.